got a weird, like a direct message from Alexis Ohanian about 2 or 3 months ago, who was like, your name came up in conversation today. It's like, okay, that's a bit odd. And he mentioned that there was some platform which I'd never heard of called Topia, and it's topia.io. I've seen a couple of these around. They're basically, it's like a virtual kind of world. So, it's essentially spatial audio. So you could, for example, you could have, let's say the one we used to do CLS in person, which we will eventually get back to, hopefully next year. And you'd have like a table over here. So there's like this virtual map, and there'll be a table over here. And then as you walk towards that table, you'll start hearing the conversation there. So it's like spatial audio. And I've seen a couple of companies doing this, and frankly, I think most of them have sucked. And I saw a demo of Topia I got on a call with their CEO, and it's pretty cool. And I think that sense of like spatial audio and space in how you communicate is kind of interesting. But we used to talk about this years ago with Second Life, and it never really quite took off. So I don't know if that's ever going to become a thing, or whether people will just stick to Jitsi and Zoom and whatever else. So
interesting. And so that's Topia.
Topia.io.
Okay. Yeah. I'll have to
a lot of vowels.
Yeah. And so is Alexis a investor in this?
Yeah, I think he's an investor. I think so. Although he just seems to be like a connector of people. But the guy who runs it, I just had a really great conversation with. He seems like a really super cool dude. And apparently they used it for like Burning Man or something like that, like virtual Burning Man or something like that, which I've never understood. Burning Man, it's just an alien concept to me. Why would go and live in the desert and drop acid? I mean, but each to their own. So but yeah, no, any other kind of, I know we've seen Gitter mentioned in the chat as well. There's been, what else have we got in here? There was Discord, of course, mentioned. What's the thinking here? Because my view has always been, it's hard to build communities with like Slack and Discord and Gitter, like with chat channels. You can do it, but I tend to think of it more as it's like the hallway track of a conference. You'll have some good information, good discussions, but you can't point to an artifact afterwards.
Yeah.
But is that an antiquated view? Like, what does everyone think?
I think it's kind of like the grease on the gears. Like it helps things move along, but you still need the gears itself, and the gears would be like GitHub or forums.
Yeah, I like that.
And I'm really curious if anybody have used these all-in-one platforms. Some of the ones that you mentioned, Jono, Hivebright, Orbit. We haven't tried anything like that before, where it seems to have more of the gears plus the grease all in one. I'd love to hear people's feedback, because it seems like that would be great. But we've never tried anything like that. We have in the past looked into things like this, but they have been so focused on sales teams or consumer products instead of just community for community's sake. And of course, contributions is part of that, but more focused on the community side, that we haven't found an all-in-one that made sense for us.
Yeah. So just before we get into that, Jen, just Phyllis is saying, I cannot see chat from other participants. Am I the only one who can't see the chat from everyone speaking chat? I think that might be because this is such a common mistake with Zoom. I think that's some of the chat that we've been putting in there as hosts and panelists. We need to make sure we select everyone when we're typing. It's bad design.
And then also, if she can make sure that she is looking at chat for everyone. I'm not sure if that.
Right.
Maybe it does show for everyone, but.
And Rachel is pointing to something. I wrote something about moving things onto a more permanent place if they're worth keeping. Oh, cool. So if anyone wants to go to rachelnorfolk.me, and it's called Turn in Ephemeral Nature Free Slack Feature. Jen, on that question of these all-in-one kind of all-you-can-eat buffet type platforms, I've got a little bit of experience I can share, because when I work with companies as a consultant, every company's got their own ideas about what's important to them and what they want to do, and I'll make recommendations, but often they'll have already picked another platform or they'll choose another platform. I think the all-in-one platforms are good for what I would consider to be what I would call a champion community, a community where you kind of go there and people have conversations, and then the point of the community is where people can share content and material and have conversations to help each other out. For what I would call a consumer community where you just kind of go and hang out with people like a book club, they don't tend to work they tend to be a bit of overkill. And for engineering communities like open source, they don't tend to work as well. My concern that I have with some of these platforms is you put all of your eggs in one basket, and frankly, for most of them that I've seen, the individual components, like they'll have a content component, the discussions component, there'll be, an events component, is that they're all a bit average. These individual pieces, they're just not really as best of breed. So I think for people who are fairly new to communities and maybe they're less technical, they don't know how to kind of glue all these pieces together. Like I would generally recommend, if you're going to have a blog and a discussion platform, for example, go best of breed, like get WordPress or Drupal and get Discourse or whatever. But for some people, clicking those Lego bricks together is going to be too complicated.
Yeah.
But the other concern I do have about some of these platforms is they're quite new, and I feel bad saying this, but they're in many cases small startups. And my worry about ecosystem startups is this is such a dynamic space right now that, if one of those platforms shuts down, then your community goes away if you're running on like a SaaS service. And the concern I have with community companies in general is they have a high level of churn, right? So if you've got a company like, I'm sure that Discourse experiences as an Orbit and various others, that, if somebody buys your platform, it's, as we all know, I mean, people who've been doing this a while, everyone who I can see on the screen has been doing this a while. Getting a community started is really hard, and it's very risky, and most of them don't work out. So therefore, if you're a community company, if you've got a platform, most of your clients, most of your customers are probably not going to be successful with your platform, and therefore you often see a lot of churn. So like people buy it and then they'll stop using it after a year and they'll stop paying. And my worry is a lot of these companies are going to go out of business. So my worry about if you have all of these all-in-one platforms is that if they go out of business, then you're screwed because everything was in there. This is why, again, open source tends to be a good option here. Like you're never going to have this problem with WordPress and Discourse because they're open source projects. So
I think also these platforms introduce an additional hurdle to getting started because you're asking somebody to learn a new tool, sign up for a new account. And, I've had plenty of people tell me, the last thing they need is to have a new community tool or chat tool or something that they have to pay attention to. So right. I think there's value in using what people are already using, even if they have to sign up a new account for your Slack or a new account for your Discourse. If they're already familiar with it, that's a lot easier step for them to take than to join a platform they've never used.
Yeah.
I think my concern with the all-in-one platforms happen to be if you don't have a huge corporate staff, like if you don't have this huge staff and you're relying on individual community contributors to like say run your blog or admin some of these things, if you have an all-in-one system, and what happens if that community person who is a volunteer gets upset and takes the keys of the kingdom with them? So to me, having separate platforms for things also ensures that no one person can ever lock you out. Like if you're, if you don't have a huge corporate staff that you're relying on all volunteers, then, keeping things kind of separate keeps that from happening, or ensures only one person can bring one piece down, not everything down. Maybe I'm a little, cynical, but how can you be cynical with the tiara on? But I can be. Like,
I love that you're wearing a tiara. It's
perfect.
There's a such thing as business tiaras, but that's another conversation.
Business tiaras, yeah.
That'd be the new uniform for conferences.
I'm totally wearing.
Hey, count me in. I'll wear a tiara to a conference.
I'm bringing you one next time.
Yeah, the only problem is I'm not sure how it'll stay in.
Super glue.
Velcro. We will Velcro it to you.
Velcro it to me.
Anyway,
Oh, I was just going to read it one quick. I'm just going to read out a message here in chat before we continue. So Heather says, for my work, we've come to the point that we cannot have one platform due to one, global network, two, people choose platforms often differently by region, e.g. Viper in some places, three, language, four, tool country restrictions. So yeah, good points.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I interrupted someone was going to say something.
No, that's okay. That makes it really tough. That makes it tough to pick one, I'm sure. Or maybe you have to work with multiple is what she's saying. I was just going to bring up the other side of the conversation where it's sort of like, okay, all in one for your community, but also the management side of it. So we're using Savannah HQ, which is an open source tool to do the internal management of our community by our team. So that's like, okay, it pulls over, it imports data every time somebody makes a contribution. And so it's our tracking system, it's our note-taking system. Like I chatted with Jane and here's all the notes from our conversation. It's the mailing addresses, the phone number so that we can send out swag. It's tracking of what swag and when we've sent it out, which is another huge part of this. Like we've done community for how many years now over at opensource.com, and we have never had a more automated tool like this. We've just used spreadsheets and documents and Google Drive and all that stuff to manually track everything. Or let's be honest, not track things because it's not automated and it's not, like a nice interface that is easy to use. And so I would recommend finding something like that allows you to, track the management side of community.
Yeah. All right. So a reminder from Jason Hibbett, who was always selling, that there's going to be a great session later today on when to reward contributions, which there is. So make sure everybody comes and joins that. It's going to be a really fun discussion. Rachel says multiple systems work well if you have a single source of identity. People should know Rachel is Rachel wherever they are in the community. Also essential for code of conduct stuff, which totally agree with Rachel on that one. And Heather also says for OpenStreetMap Foundation, we had the same issue. We made a map of which tool communications people use.
That's awesome.
Yeah. We've talked a bit about the tool, like the platforms where people have conversations, but there's been this growing trend towards these metrics platforms like Orbit, like Savannah, like ComSor. Bitergia has been around for many years in the open source world. Does anyone else have any thoughts on how these platforms, where you've used them or how you've got the most value out of them? I mean, I know we've got a separate conversation on recognizing and rewarding, as Jason said, but any other thoughts on the metric side of things, either here on video or of course in the chat?
So Rachel said something in the chat about being able to know what somebody's identity is in different platforms, and that's one of the things that I find useful about the things like Savannah and Orbit is that you can see, okay, this person who I've been talking to on Slack, they've also got an account on GitHub and Discourse, and here's what they're talking about there, so I could get additional context about what their problem is now and what their historical problems have been or topics of interest have been. To find out more that I can use to help them with whatever it is in the moment that they need help with.
Yeah, absolutely. Ray says, I find Orbit to be a great CRM tool. Yeah, the metrics side of things, I know I've had this rant before, but to me, the most important thing with any metrics tool is just making sure that I think too many people use these tools and then they expect that the tool is going to tell them what to measure and how to use that information. And it's almost always the other way around, that these tools often expose huge amounts of data in a really easy to consume way. but they can be kind of confusing if you don't really know what you're looking for, right? So I think part of this in my mind is, let's say you're measuring efficacy of an open source project, then, looking at how quickly it takes someone to respond to a pull request is going to be a good thing to track, for example. Or if you're tracking a forum, then how many page views you're getting, because, 4 out of 5 people who go to a community aren't active, right? They're just watching and consuming and lurking. So one thing I would say is, is before you use these tools are really powerful and they're enormously helpful, but having a sense of what you want to measure is really important. Otherwise, they can just be incredibly overwhelming, because often they expose so many different types of data. So, but if you know the 4 or 5 things you want to track, then I think they're a Swiss Army knife. They're invaluable. So.
Yeah, knowing the right questions to ask is still the real hard part about it. You could have all the answers, but unless you know which answers you need, you are just staring at the sea of data, hoping that something's going to jump out and say, here I am, this is what you need.
Yeah. I know we're kind of coming into the tail end of our session here, and thank you everybody for your patience with all of our AV problems that we had at the beginning of this. And thanks also to Jen and Amber for wading through it. But maybe we could just use our last few minutes just as an idea for any other shout outs of the thing I love about these kinds of sessions is you get, I'd never heard of Jitsi. Well, I'd heard of it, but I didn't really know what it was. But any other little tools or websites or services that you've used that you find helpful? Maybe if everyone wants to, panelists here, we can always shout them out and provide a bit of context, or if anyone wants to dump links into the chat, for example, I think that'd be great.
John, I think you introduced me to ConvertKit and Webinar Jam for linking up, the people who attend your webinar and then what happens afterwards, how do you track them and how do you the life cycle of your webinar viewers, which has come in handy. I don't think I use it as robustly as I could be, but at least it's a start. And the other thing is that you're talking about, Michael, what questions to ask and what answers you need. Nothing says you can't start with vanity stats and then iterate and iterate and iterate till you get it right. I mean, that's how a lot of us learned, right? We started with vanity stats and went, well, that's not telling me anything. Let's go to the next thing and let's go to the next thing. So I don't think anybody is I don't think anybody watching this should beat themselves up because they don't have their metrics exactly tuned in right now. Yeah. Just know that you pick a lane and you start, and then you figure out what works and what doesn't work. So, I think being easy on ourselves too is important as well. Just start from someplace. Don't not track anything, but start from someplace.
Yeah, I think the vanity stats are also really helpful if you want to put something to the test, where if you want to say, okay, we're going to do an online virtual event and that's going to increase our engagement in our Slack. You can use those vanity metrics to look at the before and after and see, okay, did this actually have the impact that I assumed it was going to have or not? And the same thing with the swag, like Jen said. I found out recently that we were sending out a whole bunch of shirts that we thought were getting people more and more involved in the community, and it just wasn't showing up. People would get the shirts and we'd never hear from them again.
Yeah. Just a couple I want to shout out that are in the chat as well. So hang on, Michael had mentioned, where was it? Toucan.events. Laura saying, I hope all the links in the chat will be shared out later. I do too. I don't know. All of the AV here and the setup here is run by the All Things Open team, who are doing their level best to give everyone the best experience they can, but there's always going to be bumps in the road. Lenka mentions, is that how I pronounce? Sorry, Lenka, if I'm pronouncing your name incorrectly. Gather.town, which looks really interesting, which is kind of a video conferencing using gamification. It looks similar to the thing I mentioned earlier on, Topia. There's also getopensocial.com that was mentioned by Rachel. Heather says we're using Big Blue Button for all of our events. OpenStreetMap and Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team. Our OSM etiquette code of conduct working group is used Hack for our hackmd.io for our 9 months of documentation and planning. So cool. I've not heard of a bunch of these. This is awesome. So.
Has anybody used any of the like the matchmaking things like Donut or Gather Round? Or
I meant like Tinder.
Eyes is what I'm looking at.
No.
That's a great idea. I mean, I haven't either, but I could see that being helpful.
I'm piloting one next week to see if it results, again, using vanity metrics, see if this is going to result in more community engagement over time or not.
Great. Well, I know we're out of time. Amber has very generously copied all the comments and pulled out, and it's pulling out the links, which is great. Adrian was also mentioning meetsy.io is cool. And Rachel was saying get open social integrates with BBB, so you can make events and groups that automatically open in BBB. Our next session, just so everybody knows, we've got with this 15 minutes between now and our next session. Amber and Jen are going to be facilitating, and this one is going to be on community ROI, return on investment. It's all in the same Zoom room, as far as I'm aware, I think. So this is a huge subject in community. Like, can you really put a number on a return on investment in community? So people have been talking about this for years, and we're going to fix it in the next session. We're going to figure it all out in that next session. So,
John, are you staying on as host then?
yeah, I'll just stay in, and then I'll hand it
you
over
put a
to you.
screenshot up that says what the next session will be. Can you?
Yes, I will
throw
do
a
that.
quick slide together.
Yeah, I'll go and put a quick slide together. Using my
Not that I'm
math
telling you
skills.
what to do at your own community leadership.
Hey,
Summary.
Amber, you've always been in charge. This is nothing new.
I'm a delicate flower, John.
Michael,
Michael, stop laughing.
Those two words do work: delicate and flower. All right, cool. So everyone's welcome to keep chatting. I'm going to go on mute and go and make a screenshot. Yeah, that. Anyway.
It's called a slide, Jono. It's a slide.
A slide. That's what I'm looking for, not a screenshot. I can't think and talk at the same time. All right.
I'm going to take a brief moment.
All right.
Michael, where'd you go? There you are. I haven't talked to you in forever. Now
I know, not since we went and saw you over in New Orleans. How's it going?
It's been that long. And you just an hour from me. Like,
I know.
I was on the Parkway yesterday. Like,
it's weird. Like, proximity really has nothing to do with how often I see people. Like,
no.
I was 30 minutes away from Chris Johnston for years, and we still only saw each other when we went to a conference together.
You know, so what are you doing these days? I love these breaks because then I get to interview people. So what are you doing these days? I'm
over at Influx Data now. So Rick Spencer went over there and has been hiring as many former Canoniclers as he can.
Oh, wow.
So I'm doing community over there.
Well, that's awesome. What do you think? What do you think the greatest lesson you learned, not only being, with Canonical, but it's part of the Ubuntu community? Like, what do you think that greatest lesson was that you were able to take with you? And you can't say that Johnny was a great community leader. You just
I'd never say that.
It has to be something other than that. So.
It's hard to pick, like, what's the top one? I think the biggest one, and the one that I have the hardest time conveying, because it really, I think you need the experience, is just how much you can trust community people to do what's best for your project and your company, even if they've got no financial stake in it.
It's amazing how the willingness and that circle of trust is there. Like, and folks who've never, when you go somewhere where there's the corporate entity side, and then there's the project side, and sometimes there's a gray line, and other times there's a hard line between church and state. And if you look at it, the folks who've never participated personally in community really have a hard time trusting the community piece of it, because they've never sat on that side of it. They've never had skin in the game, if you will, but now all of a sudden they have to work with this open source entity. And that's a hard concept I also think that it goes deeper than that and shows this general distrust in enterprise side of management and things like that. So that's a whole other cultural issue that's happening, but
Yeah.
community doesn't seem to have that as much.
There's some reluctance still in like engineering. If you have engineers who are not from the open source world, they view engineers in the community as something separate from them. And it's like, they shouldn't be touching this. They shouldn't be messing with it. It's playing with fire for them to interact with these outside people. And tearing down those kinds of misconceptions and those fears has been a challenge. We recently brought in some people to help maintain one of our main open source projects, Telegraph, and like gave them commit access to the repos, let them review PRs and stuff. And it took a lot of convincing to show that we can trust these people to do it. It's okay. We're not giving away the kingdom by giving them these permissions. They really want to help. They want to make it better. They care every bit as much about this project as we do, even if their company's not the one making it. And it's worked out really well. We've been able to burn down. We had this huge backlog of PRs that we've been able to go through. We've been landing new features. They're helping people out writing new plugins for it. So they've really taken that ownership, like what we used to see with Ubuntu, where they're driving the project forward now. And that's really nice to see. And I'm trying to replicate that in other parts of the company.
Oh yeah, and I think sometimes when you're when I look back at the days in the Fedora community and the Ubuntu community and all of those type of things, and I look back and I think about how big those communities really are. I mean, they're operating systems, so they're a little bit bigger than say the project I work on now with is very niche. It's cybersecurity, network security monitoring, that sort of stuff. Still big user base, but the developer base is very small by consideration when you look at Fedora, when you look at Ubuntu, and pick other distributions. And I think it's hard to, when you come from that type of participation, when you see 60,000 plus contributors, when you can go back and see that many contributors and how many tens of millions of users that are out there, and then you go to a smaller organization that might not have that much, it's sort of hard to, but this works and you get excited about it and you want to show people it and all that stuff, and they're, oh no, we're still a few steps behind. We need to go back to basics, or we need to go, build this foundation and then bring people into it. I don't know if you've experienced that since then, but I know I have.
A little bit of that. And another thing I've experienced, and maybe you have too, is that, when we were doing Linux distros, that was something people used at home. That was something that interested them outside of work hours. Whereas a time series database, not so much. There's a few people doing hobby projects with it, but most of our community interest is coming from, they need this for their job.
Yep.
And so they'll be around Monday through Friday, 9 to 5 their time, but they're not necessarily going to go out of their way, spend their weekends and their free time contributing to it or promoting it. So the motivations are different, the needs are different with a product like InfluxDB than they were for Ubuntu.
It's the same way with the Zeek community, formerly known as Bro, a network security monitoring tool. It's now a framework because it's a language and this monitoring tool, and it's very niche. It's and I say niche, but everybody it's used in a lot of places, but the community support isn't, because people aren't, downloading Zeek to use on their home network. If they're using it at home, chances are they're having to use it at work. So, your community is located in different places than, say, the home, people who like you or I used to do, spend every waking moment, volunteering to either write or, do a newsletter or fix code or whatever it happens to be. It's different when it's your motivation comes from work rather than home, so.
Yep. Oh, there's the slide.
There's the slide. I'm going to pop off for a minute, but I always like catching up with people and I always sort of seeing what else is going on. Cause I think those of us who kind of, learn by doing and made mistakes and, been doing this for we won't even talk about how many years, but
No, let's not talk about that.
We don't need to talk about age, but
Yeah,
I think I think people would benefit from just the chit chat, or at least that's what I was told after last year. So I decided I would just continue interviewing people on the breaks. Like,
Yeah.
Like old times.
Exactly.
Show up in Ubuntu User Magazine.
Oh, you know what? I miss those days. I was looking at the issue that I think Pete was in, the first one. And Ricky had made me this little card of the title, and it was in his office. I was like, oh man, you still have this. So, but those were good days. So I'm gonna be right back. And then John, if there's still time, I'm gonna like pick your brain for a minute. Maybe on the next break.
Pick away. There's not much in there, but feel free to pick.
As long as it's not your nose, I'll be fine. As long as
stay away from that.
Shall return.
How you doing, Mike?
Doing all right. I had to be up.
How's things with Savannah?
What?
How's things with the project?
They're going okay. I just released Salesforce integration, which was a lot harder to do than I initially thought it was going to be. Like, I should have known going into Salesforce that it wasn't going to be simple, but
right.
Yeah, that took way longer than I thought it was going to, but
right,
it's out now, and I'm happy about that. Now I can iterate on it.
Yeah, that's cool. Well, that's what it's all about, right? So
yeah.
Are you finding more and more people using it now?
I haven't really been promoting it much these last couple of months.
Right.
Personal life and work life has kind of been busy, so I've been slowly building out this functionality that I didn't want to talk about until it was done. So like my communication was a little bit dormant for a while.
Right. But it's hard, isn't it? Like when you're spending so much of your time, the valuable free time that you do have, like away from work and family, and you're building it, and then having, then you need to promote it as well. That's just a lot to do. So
yeah, there's so many hats. Like I can write code all day long, but writing marketing copy, I just kind of stare at this blank Google Doc, like, what do I write now?
Right.
But I took the family on a road trip up to Maine earlier in August. So I was
nice.
Away for a while for that. And like we hit up some of the amusement parks, like we hit Hershey Park in Pennsylvania, which was loads of fun.
Oh, cool. My my father-in-law used to live there, and he said that the streets all smell like chocolate. Is that?
Oh yeah, everything smells of chocolate around there.
Oh God.
I would imagine you get sick of it after a while.
Yeah, I mean, it's got to make dieting difficult if you live in Hershey, Pennsylvania. Like, everything smells like chocolate.
Yeah, and like probably half the town is employed by Hershey, so you're probably around it even more.
Right. Yeah.
Did anybody answer Adrian's question? Not sure if it got answered. It was just about chat. I think we're having issues with people seeing everything. So he was asking if he did something wrong and could only chat to the panelists.
Yeah, I think if you're just an attendee, that's all you can do. Like the Zoom webinar thing doesn't let attendees talk to each other, which I find kind of dumb.
Oh.
Yeah. I didn't. Yeah, it seems like our chat is.
That's too bad.
Pretty limited here. So.
I think because it's a webinar, not a meeting. If it was a meeting, then attendees talk.
Yeah.
Because it's set up as a webinar, then it limits the.
Maybe I wish we could have like a posted message. Maybe we can pin something that's like, if you want to be part of the discussion, please raise your hand and we'll add you as a panelist.
Yeah, let me see if we've got an option in here.
Well, you can put stuff in there, but if people join after you've posted, they won't see anything before they join. So you would have to continually refresh that message.
Yeah.
We could just use IRC. Does anyone still use IRC and have an IRC client? I haven't had one installed in years.
Not since we switched to Slack at work or for the project. It was like
Adrian suggesting ICQ.
ICQ. Mirrorless.
Gwibber. Let's go back to the Gwibber days.
Yeah, I looked into IRC when the guy who took over the Wolverhampton Linux user group took over. Like he was like, "Can you give me the password for the channel?" Which it's like I can't remember what it was, let alone how. I can't remember how to get into IRC, let alone how to change the password. So, all right, I'm going to stop sharing the screen. All right, I think. Should we get started? Should we talk about ROI?
Let's do it.
Sure, let's do it. Probably my least favorite thing.
I mean, that's how it is, right? You get signed up for the thing you're more uncomfortable with, which this is a tough one. So, Jono, good job.
I'll let Jono pick.
Yeah.
You know,
Right.
what I get.
Well, I will introduce what I was thinking of with this subject. So, first of all, welcome everybody to CLS. If you are new and you're just joining right now, we've been having some AV challenges today. I think just ATO has been having some issues with some of the virtual pieces, which, you know, I just encourage everyone to be patient because the folks at ATO are doing the best that they can. It's hard running an event, let alone running an event online and in person at the same time. So we appreciate your patience. So the idea of this session was, you know, with a lot of companies that are investing in communities, whether it's around an open source project or whether it's around something else, invariably the question is always going to be, am I getting out of this what I want to get out of this? And I think we all will face this as well. Like if each of us was to set up a community around, you know, we were just talking about Savannah, for example, that Mike's building. You know, there'll be questions inevitably in his head at some point around if I spend a bunch of time building a community around this, what's the net benefit for the project? And then everyone usually will agree with that, but then the elephant in the room question is, well, what do you measure to determine a return on investment? Like, what are the numbers? And I think what will be interesting in this conversation will be for us to literally throw out some ideas for the things that we think are important to measuring communities, and just to explore each other's ideas around what that might mean, because there'll be some folks will have some cool ideas, some people will have some other ideas. And from what I can tell, it basically breaks into two areas. You've got kind of the measurable things that you can literally grab right now, like, for example, in an open source project, how many pull requests have you received? How many issues have you received? But then the thing that I think we're all attracted to in communities is the kindness, the empathy, the collaboration, the human pieces that we all cherish so much. So, you know, Jen's popped a couple of things into the chat there. So maybe Jen, do you want to kind of, I know you and Amber are facilitating this. Do you want to kind of kick this off and share some ideas?
Yeah, I love the breakdown between, you know, the more obvious things that you can measure. And these are, I feel like the things that I dropped in chat are part of that, like number of members, number of people that are part of your community, you know, just the sheer size of it. And then if you want to look a little bit deeper, the number of active members. And then, you know, what does it mean to be active? So for us, and I think most communities, we're talking about number of contributions, and you can track how many of those are coming through. And then another thing that we look at is number of posts, which is really more about that discussion piece, which is really about that collaboration piece, you know, which is the other side of it, is how do you track sort of the human interaction part? And then what does that mean to you? And that's where it can get squishy, you know, like how do you, is it, if it's just number of posts, you know, what else is it? What else do you track that tracks the collaboration and the conversation and the types of conversations that's happening? One thing that we've seen in our community is people have discussions and somebody gets a job out of a collaboration conversation they've had with somebody in their community. Or they get a promotion, or they write a book, or they have like 5 new ideas for ways to contribute that they didn't have 5 minutes ago. And so to me, that's a really that's a indicator of health of your community.
Yeah.
Are positive things coming out of this and like rippling out, the ripple effect. And so, we don't track that in a like, writing down everything that's said kind of way, but we are doing these things with our team where we do these weekly and monthly health checks. So I'm on discourse, monitoring conversations, being part of them when it's appropriate, giving information when it's appropriate, but also letting the community do their own thing. And then I'll have a conversation with my team every week or every month to, we kind of do different things at different times, where I'm giving feedback about where I think the health of the community is, based on kind of the vanity numbers, but also the more squishy parts. And I'm kind of doing that from just like here's my perspective, so I feel like there's a lot of, I don't want to say pressure, but there's a lot on the community manager to be able to get that pull that kind of information out and then share it with the team. It's really like, that's part of your responsibility as that person, to be able to do that.
I just think it's so tricky. Like when it's easy when it comes to development stuff and, measuring all the stuff that you see in GitHub. That, I mean, it's pretty easy, but like what the content and, like you said, the health, like writing those motivational paychecks and knowing, what account to draw those paychecks off of. Is somebody there trying to like build their resume? Is somebody there trying to live in perpetuity? Is somebody like all these different motivators for people being part of your community? But you said something interesting, Jen, and that is number of members, like the members. And I think sometimes people forget that users and members aren't the same thing, that there's a conversion that happens from being a user. You can measure your users. You can sort of, like people say, oh, number of downloads. Well, I know when I was back in the Ubuntu community, like I might download Ubuntu 10 times for a new release. So I kind of divide those download numbers by 3 at a minimum and then go from there. But like, if you don't have your community defined, like what is a community member, that's kind of like, you really need that to even have a start. So if you're just throwing, every user in that bucket, then I think you're kind of missing the real health of a community. So one, defining what your membership looks like, and then what is that conversion between user and contributing member? And then what does contributions look like? Because if you haven't defined what contribution looked like, then you don't know, you're just kind of guessing. So you have to figure out what's important to your community, I think.
So
yeah, I agree.
That's a really good point, and it's a conversation that's come up around Savannah over and over and over again. Is where do you draw this line between somebody who's using or consuming something that you've done, but is not yet a community member? So like if somebody stars your GitHub repo, they're not in your community, they're not engaging with anybody in your community. So should you count that person towards one of your metrics or not? Is kind of a question.
On that note, what I did a little bit of, I'm not an academic by any stretch, but I did a little bit of research into like what proportion of community members are active or not. And I mentioned this earlier, I kind of dropped this in earlier on in the previous session, that from what I can tell, about 1 in 5 people who come to your community are going to be the people who are going to be using their finger on their cell phone and their fingers on their computers to interact. They're going to be writing things, typing things, responding to things, liking things, interacting in some way. But I'm basing this a little bit on what the folks at Spotify did with guilds, and also some of the data that I've seen, for example, in trust levels inside of discourse. And one of the things that I think we might want to factor into this is exactly the subject of, all too often when I work with companies and they're looking at growth, it's growth of registered users who are interacting in some way with the community. Whereas in my mind, the vast majority of your community members are going to be just watching. They may never register. You may never know their name. but they'll be watching the conversations and enjoying the conversation. I mean, just look at what we're doing right now. We've got a bunch of people watching this stream who are not participating, and that's totally fine. So they're getting value out of the conversation without typing into the chat or joining as a panelist, and that's great. So it seems like that should be a really key element that we should track in some way, and that might be as simple as page views to a forum, right? Or it could be stars in GitHub or something along those lines.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I really love that, Jono, because one thing I'm starting to try to look in deeper with opensource.com specifically is like, okay, we've got these core community groups that we've identified, like top contributors, like we know what the contribution is, we know who they are. It's a small enough group to where like we know everybody's name, they're treated, there's all these benefits, there's the program. But what about all the people who are not in that? They're not engaging at this high level. They're not participating at this high level. They still matter. They still are awesome. And we love them and we want them to be here. And, they may or may not ever get to this top contributor program. And again, that's okay. It's not for everyone. And that's not even the point. The point is to whatever is the point, everybody has a different point, a different mission, kind of to Amber's point, like what's the point of this? Who are your members? What's the goal? What's the mission? And identifying that really helps you kind of break it into buckets. But I love thinking about how do we nurture, if we can, people who are just on these lower participation levels does not mean they're not as important.
I read a paper a while back, and I'll have to see if I can find the link. It was from some Korean guy, I think, but he was looking at the way people interact with others in the community, and he showed that you'll often have these people who are highly engaged. They'll talk to like dozens of people at a time, and then you'll have people who just engage with like 2 or 3 people. But sometimes, that person who's got 3 interactions is interacting with 3 different groups in different parts of your community that have no other overlap. And so like they become this bridge between these different subgroups in your community. Even if they're not the most active, even if they're not the most engaged, they help bring it all together still.
I just read an article about, I feel like something that you're touching on, which is like called the integrator in some of these conversations. And it's this unpaid, in a way, unseen work of these people who are integrators. They're bridges. They're doing this quiet, more silent work that really helps your community be a community. And then how can you identify who those people are? Say thank you. It's work that some people feel burdened by, I think, at the end of the day, because they want to give. They that's like a natural thing they do, is be this integrator, this bridge. But they're not seen in the traditional sense because they're not a high contributor. They're not doing these things that you've identified as the most important stuff. So I love that idea. And I don't know if there are ideas for that, but
it's a really hard thing to put a number on. Like anything you can put a number on, it's easy to find the top people for, but stuff like that where you can't, there's not a real good way.
I know I got laughed at many years ago when I was in a bunch of community, because I said, no, the people who are organizing a release party, or the people who are, making the cakes and bringing the cookies and driving people there, all these people are important, because without each one of them doing their part, we wouldn't have had a successful event. And so when you look at your events versus your developers, like who are the people who, because would you really want, like, and I can say this because I live with a developer, would I really want like him planning an event? Oh, heck no. But, you don't want the people who don't have a people personality to be the ones to be interacting, because they're all going to leave, right? Like, so, identifying those people who don't write code, they're just as important as the people who are writing code. And I think sometimes people lose sight of that. Like they lose sight of the bigger picture and only focus on one lane. Were you able to figure out a way to like say thank you to those people or identify who they were? Oh yeah, I went to I don't know, I was probably off my rocker, but I went to a lot of different release parties and organized release parties and identified people who said, I can't write code, but I can do this. And I would always ask for people to do whatever this happened to be that had nothing to do with the code. And we would find those people, and Jono was good, when he was, and even Michael being on the same team, everybody was pretty good about not putting blinders on to those folks who didn't write code. And everybody sort of made it a priority to include contributors other than code. And so, but it was a priority across the board, not just me saying, oh, we need to do it. Jono's team also was like, no, this is important and we need to identify them. So you have to get more than one person saying that their contribution is important.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, there's even people who it's like, yeah, so there are all these roles outside of just being a coder, but there's even these more even silent roles. There's not like the guy who's organizing the event, the girl who's doing the marketing. It's like the person who's just having these like conversations and uplifting others. And I don't know how to really call those out other than try to be an observant community manager and just say thank you when you see it happening. So maybe there's a tip around like a lot of thanks.
I used to just keep a list. Like I would just keep a list as I would identify those people. I would just put them in a spreadsheet with a date, whatever it was. And then at the end of the year, I would try to share that list with somebody. Somebody that wasn't me, because I mean, when you're the community person, like you're interacting with people, but you want somebody who isn't maybe the one out front, but well known inside of organization, to let them also say thank you. So it's kind of like having a doctor in your family where you say, oh, this hurts, and then they give you your advice and you go, oh, yeah, but I know you too well, let me go ask another doctor. Like people know their community people really well, but if somebody in a higher role or more street cred or whatever says thank you to people, that makes a difference too.
Yeah. So just before we go on, just if anyone's got any thoughts on this, if you've got ideas for things we should be discussing in terms of ROI, feel free to pop it into the chat. I know we're having some issues with the chat today. Ray, as if my magic has posted something. Great minds, Ray. And we'll make sure we read things out. We're all keeping an eye on the chat. Ray says, I've been surprised at how and what some community members are contributing through random coffee chats with people that I find on Slack, which is a reinforcement of that point. I wonder whether as just as a kind of thread of conversation here, when people talk about a return on investment, it presupposes that there is a clear goal. Like, if you've got a business and you buy a platform like Salesforce, right? Then the general idea is that the amount of profit that you make in your business should more than pay for the costs of using Salesforce, and that's like the clear ROI. But it gets really weird with communities. So I wonder whether we should talk a little bit about like how do people frame the purpose and goals of a community? Because I know I think we all, at least the folks who I know in this discussion, we all come at this from this like a significant philosophical viewpoint that communities are good for the world and they're the right thing to do. And there's a kind of an ethical component to this. But does anyone here have any thoughts on how to frame the purpose of it? So then when you talk about ROI, you're tying it to a goal.
So I learned to ask the executive team and my manager what value they want to get out of the community. Because I worked at a place where I didn't do this, I was told, we want to build the community. So I went out and I started building community, and we got a lot more people involved in the community. And then a year later, the company's like, well, we're not making money. Like, well, you didn't ask me to make money. You asked me to grow your community, and I did that. But that wasn't what they wanted. Like, they wanted it to lead to increased sales, but there was this gap. Is like that old slash dot thing. Like step 1, step 2, step 3 is just question marks, and step 4 is profit. So now when I'm interviewing, like I ask, what exactly do you want to get out of the community? What is the return that you're hoping to get, so that I can, look and see what metrics I can provide to show that we're doing that. And that's often things like mind share, which is, a harder thing to judge. But also more concrete things like, the amount of feedback coming in. I've started using Product Board to track feedback coming in from the community. The number of support offset that happens. So how many questions are being answered in your forums and in your Slack that are not going to your support team and support tickets for. And so being able to tie metrics directly back to what I have been told is the value that they want to see from the community makes that easier, because most people, like, it doesn't make a difference to the bottom line if you grow your community size. So what might feel like success to you doesn't look like success when it comes to budget planning.
I really love those two things that the company asked you to track, because I feel like that's really also understanding what community can actually give back. Because I feel like sometimes that's part of the problem too, is expecting something from the community that they actually can't give you, which is maybe just increased revenue, right? Like it's not just about the bottom line, it's actual tangible things. So Michael, do you feel like you had to get them to a place where they understood that?
Yeah, like nobody had a ready answer. It was a thing that everybody I asked had to stop and think about, because it seems that there's this like field of dreams approach that if you build it, success will come. And making them actually think about what success was, other than just, oh, we need a community, because successful companies have communities.
Yeah.
I think too, John, I can't remember which book, it might have been People Powered. I think it was People Powered, where you kind of talk about, community of product, community of practice, and I think too, a lot of companies, when they start measuring stuff, they don't know whether they want to, especially when there's 2 lanes or more. Do they want to measure the practice side? Do they want to measure the product side? And sometimes those are very 2 individual lanes. Like there might be, like you do the Venn diagram, the overlap of the 2, but the metrics that you measure for practice are different than the metrics that you measure for product. At least that's what I've found. And then, trying to figure out, okay, if you hold this event and sales gets 15 leads out of it, and out of that 15, 3 of them turn to sales, then great, there's your product side, there's that. But your practice side, knowing what to measure there, I think is a little fuzzier when you overlay the enterprise, the stakeholders and stuff like that. So I think also understanding which metrics, like which practice do you want to monitor? And if you have to monitor both, then one may be good for your company bottom line, the other one might be good for your your contributing bottom line, if you will. So I think some people don't take the time to break it up into the lanes that they're actually in, and which causes to get the ROI wrong when you're trying to measure practice against product. So
yeah, no, I agree. I just want to read something out just to make sure I'm participating on the chat side of things. Brian says, I think the challenge is tying community work to goals and metrics the organization already has in place, not inventing new ones to justify the community-focused approach. If a community approach doesn't serve the organization's goals in some way that's better than a different approach, then a community-focused approach isn't the approach the organization should be taking. It's a good point. I've generally been of that view that if you don't tie a community at some point to their goals, then even if the community may get the energy in the short term, but at some point, unless the community is successful, it will be defunded essentially. So a lot of community managers operate in a world where like I want nothing to do with sales, and I get that, because I think like insulating a community team away from that is a good idea. Like when Mike and I were at Canonical, for example, the team that was building the commercialization around Ubuntu was a separate team to our team. Like the team that was building Ubuntu that everybody gets, that's free, was deliberately isolated away from the enterprise side of things. I think that made a lot of sense. But if that should, to Brian's point, in my mind, be weaved into the ROI, like at some point, there's a series of interconnecting steps that might be growing your brand or growing the business or whatever it might be. So Brian says, I agree. To just add a finer point, community is just a goal. It's a strategy for accomplishing goals. So any other thoughts on things that we should track? Because we've been talking about, like, okay, what is the purpose of the community? And then that seems to be to use a, I don't know what the right architectural term, that's a child of the parent, which is the overall goals of the business, if we're talking about businesses. And then we've already talked as well about there's active members and inactive members. So we're kind of designing a bit of a hierarchy of how all these pieces glue together. What else are we not thinking about?
So one of the things that I've tried to do with Savannah, and to Amber's point earlier about how you've got people who are doing things like hosting events or bringing food to events that aren't contributing code, but are still contributing to bringing people in who will contribute code. So one of the things that I've been looking at is, if I get a list of people who have contributed code over the last month, and then I look at who they've talked to in the days or weeks prior to their contribution, do the same names keep popping up? And I've seen that there are some people in my community who are not big contributors, but they talk to a lot of people who become contributors. And so they're they're the way into the door for the people who go on to become the important contributors in the community. And so those are people that I need to boost up more and thank them and reward them and make sure that they are happy continuing to do what they do and try and grow the number of people that are doing that. So it's almost like second and third degree levels of contribution that you need to look at.
Yeah.
Because those funnel directly into the ones that you directly want to increase.
Yeah, I really love the idea too that we're touching on around some ROI of the community being improving the health of the community itself. The community manager can't do everything. So you have these other people who in the community who help you make it a healthy and wonderful place to be. And it's a feedback loop. So identifying who those folks are and what the things are that they're doing, I think is something that we've touched on quite a few times here that is really harder to do, but important to do.
I think, making those diagrams, like one of the things that I used to do quite often, because I was still kind of learning about this. Here's your core. Like if you do the rings, right? You have your core, your people who actually run things, and then you've got your next layer of contributors and your next layer on out to your lurkers, right? On out to your folks who know about it. And you want that information, to measure it so that information comes in and goes out very free flowing. But I think identifying what your technical goals are, what are you going to measure on the technical side? And then what are you going to measure on the contributor side beyond code? And then what do you consider a success? And again, I keep going back to Jono's stuff. I'm not intentionally pimping his books, but I kind of am. Like in Art of Community, he has like the on-ramps. And then like what skills what tasks do you need? What skills do you need? What defines success? And then what's the reward? And if you follow that same methodology to what you need to measure, like what do you need? What do people need to do to get to that point? And then how do you reward them? But if you break it down into here's your technical measurements, here's your non-technical measurements, and then even beyond that, like what contributions look like beyond standard contributions. If you make that list, then you can figure out how to measure it. But if you don't even have the list, you don't even know what you should measure. So I always try to start with the list first and then figure out how you measure it.
So teasing on kind of pulling on that thread, Amber, it sounds like, as we kind of glue all these pieces together in this conversation, it seems like, there's the broader goals of the business, then what sits underneath that is going to be the goals of the community. But then what that is defined by is going to be, it's going to be kind of somewhat in service of the business, but then it's going to be, adding value to members, right? And I think what we've talked about here as well is, okay, well, then there needs to be a conversation around, well, who is your audience, right? Who you're prioritizing. So if we look at open source, I mean, God, you can have users of projects, you can have developers to write code, people who write docs, people who set up local user groups. You can have, all kinds of different subdivisions of a community. And you can't do all of them all of the time, right? So
Nope.
what do we all think about? Because essentially what we're doing is, it seems like we're designing an architectural diagram of a community. And then in each of those buckets, we're kind of assigning numbers, right? So we could say, okay, the overall success of the community is going to be this number. I don't even know what that number would be. But let's say it's the number of registered users is a silly one. But then if we start saying, okay, well, we want to grow developers in an open source project, that's a key metric. Then we'd probably have things like the number of pull requests submitted and the number of code contributions, whatever else. But that then begs the question, how do we decide who are the audiences? And then how do you tie that back to the upper bits, like the overall goal of the community and then the overall goal of the business? Does anyone have any thoughts on that? And just before anyone answers, I just want to read out, Ray says a key value from communities, insights on how they're using your product. This tends to be pretty difficult to measure, e.g. beyond feature requests on GitHub and GitLab. So any thoughts on like how we, like, it seems like what you're saying, Amber, is we got to be specific in who our audiences are going to be if you want to get any kind of return on anything.
Well,
so how do we decide that?
Well, exactly. I think like I can just go for me, like right now in this moment, I know what the corporate goal is, and then I know what the project goal is, and then there's an overlap between the two. But then you have to break down what your piece of, like, what's the community piece that drives the success of either the organization or the project, if they're two different entities. A lot of times they're not, but in my case, there are two different entities and they had different goals. And then like from there, it's like, okay, what are your big buckets? Again, this goes back to, you can tell I've hung out with you too long, Jono. The big goals, the big rocks. Like what are the 3 to 5 of those that then support the goals of the other? So I never was a fan of this, but it works. And like, just breaking everything down, like this is the goal and here's how I'm going to support it. And these are the tasks that support this particular goal. These are the tasks that support this particular goal. And it's time consuming. It takes a couple of weeks really to do it right. Like you sit down at the end of the year and go, this is what it is. And this is how you work toward it. So I don't know what everybody's individual communities are, but if you know what your corporate goal is, assuming that you belong to a corporate entity, you know what that corporate goal is, then you break down what is going to be my piece of supporting this corporate goal, the community piece. So, and then once you break down what that looks like, then you break that down into quarterly goals. And then here's how we're going to measure the success, those KPIs, if you will. Like here's how you do that. But it first starts with knowing what your overall goal is. And if you don't know what that is, then you've got to figure it out. And so I think if you, like I have this, you helped me with it and modified it a little bit, and we can totally share it with the group. Like here's how you write this down and here's how you break it down and you track it. And then you add whatever's specific to your organization, like not, here you got a great outline of it, but then when you start looking at your individual communities, you fill in the blanks as what's important to the overall goals of either your project or your corporate entity. So,
right.
I think, Jana, you mentioned how we've got like this architecture of community where we've got it all split up into these different things. And I think like taking like a sprint approach and saying, okay, this week or this month, I want to increase the number of people writing docs. And so that's like your main focus, that sprint. You're not worried about increasing PRs. You're not interested about, increasing the number of questions being answered on your forums. That's your focus. That's your metric for that short term. You do the work on that, you measure the results, and then you look at, okay, what's the next part of my community that needs that kind of focus?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think that's the key. I mean, I kind of feel divided on this in some ways, because on one hand, as a general rule, my view is if you want to do anything, you want to do it well, you got to do it with intention, right? You got to go in there and say, okay, I'm going to set out with these goals. And at least even if that goal is really narrow and simple, and then compare what you did to it, right? We've got to analyze what we were doing. But there's a lot of people out there who, you know, when they build communities, they just kind of chuck up a forum and get cracking, you know. So my preferred approach is much more, I guess you could say, it's much more rigorous and organized, which isn't for everyone. And I don't know if you can only start getting a semblance of ROI out of, you know, if you go through the work of like, okay, these are our company goals, these are our community goals, these, to Amber's point, like these are the big rocks for the next 6 months, these are the things we're going to focus on, and these are all the things we're going to measure. I like that, but that's a lot of upfront work for someone to do. So I don't know if it's feasible. Yeah, Jen was asking about what you've experienced there, Mike, with your project.
So I mentioned that I started using Product Board to track feedback, and Product Board was really meant for like engineering teams to track feedback on what features they should be building. But my team has been using it to track like what problems are people encountering, what questions keep coming up over and over again. And we can assign that to, you know, docs or blog posts or videos that we want to produce to try and preemptively answer those common things. And that's worked out really well for us. It's got integrations for Slack. It's got a Chrome extension that you can use to like pull in stuff from your discourse. And I've got it now pulling in questions on Stack Overflow that use the InfluxDB tag. And so that kind of gives us a sense of, you know, what problems are people having that we weren't aware of that we need to start focusing more on. And it's worked really, really well for us for that use case.
So is it tracking keywords and then you just kind of follow that?
Yeah, so it's got two pieces. It's got insights, which are just like chunks of text that you're getting from somewhere, Slack or forums or whatever. And then you tag those two features that you plan on doing. So for me, it would be like, you know, documentation or a blog post. And then you can see over time that, okay, this one topic has like 5 or 6 people who have been asking about it. So that's a higher priority for me then to produce content for that than, you know, something that I might have otherwise wanted to write, but is not going to help as many people.
That is so
And yeah,
interesting.
I'll find a link to that.
It's productboard.com. Is that what you said it was, Mike?
Yep, productboard.com. That's it.
I'll post it here, and I'll put it in the notes too. That
Yeah, it occurs to me, I mean, that could even be really helpful for teams, whether it's a community or just a team where it's like, okay, well, what are we going to focus on next based on what people are just talking about, discussing, chatter. So yeah, it's really neat.
And my product team is using it too. So they're using it the way it's intended to be, where they're tracking like actual code features that they want to produce based on this feedback. But that's, again, another nice way that, you know, I can take what's being said in the community and send that directly to these engineering teams as part of their product board features to say, okay, here's all the people that are going to be affected by this feature once you get it done and put it out.
Cool. What are we not talking about in this conversation? Like, what have we not dug into? I think we've covered a reasonable amount of ground. We've started like constructing some of these pieces together, but what are we missing in this conversation that's important?
How about talking about when what's good for the company isn't good for the community? Like,
yeah,
you know, if you start tracking everyone in your community, you've got this huge list of contacts. Why not just hand that over to the sales team to start cold calling everybody that's, you know, joined your community? Where do we draw the line between what will increase ROI by, you know, like damaging your reputation in the community?
Yeah, I was actually going to bring up something similar, which my take on that was going to be talking about conversations between the community manager and the community manager's boss, and that person's boss and that person's boss, and just how those happen and how they go and what's part of those conversations. I will just start by saying, I think there's a lot of trust that needs to be there if it's not there, to foster a community at a corporation. I've been with opensource.com for 8 years, going on 9, and I've had a lot of conversations with my manager, and he's having conversations with his manager, and it's like, how do we fund this? What matters? What's the ROI? I mean, that's like the huge conversation all the time. And I do think that part of this, and I don't know if Jason Hibbets is still in this call, but is trusting your community manager to know what is healthy and what's not healthy, and then really just having those open conversations about what that means. If you have somebody trying to tell you how to run a community who is not a community manager or is not coming at it from that, like Jonah, something you said a minute ago about like, we believe in community for community's sake. If you're having a conversation with somebody who is not doing it for that reason, like, what is that conversation like?
Yeah, I mean, this is such a big topic in my mind. Like my personal view here is there's got to be real clarity on like the purpose of all this, and I think what makes this we should have like a dedicated, maybe, I know we don't have time today with ATO, but this would be a really fun conversation for us to just put together as like a webinar or something, like outside of the event. Maybe it could be CLS +1. Just like, how do you get clarity on that? Like, because I think part of the challenge here is the word community means a million different things to a million different people. The one thing I can say, for just as a tiny data point, for example, if I have a prospective client and I don't feel like we're aligned on what communities are going to be, I won't work with them, because it never works. It never works out. So, but I think part of the challenge there is often like the kind of folks who have signed into this, who are dialed into this today, into this session, we're very detail oriented. We're interested in the details of community. Whereas if you're like a CEO of a company, or if you're a business unit owner or something like that, often there isn't that level of depth needed. Like it can be we just want to grow the brand. And beyond that, they don't really care about how it's done, they just need to get it done. So I think that alignment is critical. But there's a lot to how you do that, right? So
I think another thing is like, what are you giving back to the community? And I like to even think about that on like, what is an individual getting back? Okay, they're going to give you things. What do you really honestly in reality give back to their life? And if you can identify some things, then I feel like that in my playbook is an ethical relationship. If you really can't identify anything, or it's literally just swag, it might not be like the level of ethical community, to Heather's point in the comments. And maybe everybody has a different idea of that. But I think if you can really make a list that are real things that matter to people, that you can kind of start the conversation there.
Great. I'm not sure if I missed this, if anyone read this out. Laura, are there good survey or poll systems for assessing soft benefits of community, e.g. someone helped me, or I felt motivated by a chat with someone? How best to capture this sort of thing to demonstrate ROI?
I love that, kind of like a community survey. We don't do that as much as I would like to. Would love to hear if there are survey tools people like.
The problem with surveys is it's so hard to get enough people to respond to be able to have useful data in there. It would be great if there was an automated way to collect this kind of thing. I have not seen anything like it. I have certainly tried, with Savannah to be able to do stuff like this, but there's so much that just never get spoken, that you can't capture anywhere.
I think that's where those one-on-one conversations and the relationships that you have to build individually and build that circle of trust and all of those things. I think measuring that isn't, like, to your point, Michael, like, people don't write that on surveys, but if you can catch them like in the hallway track, if you will, or, you know, during the break on one of these type of things or whatever, you kind of get that feedback and then funnel it somewhere. Again, however, but I don't know, those type of questions are really hard to get people to answer on a survey for some reason.
It occurs to me. Go ahead.
I do try and like lurk in my own Slack, so I will go open up threads and just read through them. And when I see that somebody's being helpful on there, I jump into Savannah and I mark that on their profile. But again, that kind of depends on me seeing it, which means that there's a lot of stuff that I don't see that's not going to get tracked.
You could, like, on Slack channels, having like a kudos channel or a thank you. So when somebody says thanks, it automatically goes to that channel, like, or hashtag kudos, it goes to that channel. Then you can go back like at the end of the week and see, how many unique thanks were given or gratitude shown or whatever. I mean, that's just one way, and that's just on Slack. I don't know.
I freaking love that. We could, I'm wondering if on our discourse, we could create a whole new category that's kudos. And it's just like, anytime you have something you want to share in this thread, like, I love that.
Yeah.
I'm gonna do that right
to your point about, tracking people who just say thanks. I do have that in Savannah where it just looks for keywords. And you can kind of see over time how many people are saying thank you. You can see who's being the target of the thanks more often than others. And that has been a helpful metric for me. That's not necessarily something I can use for ROI, but it's helpful for me to see, okay, who are the real positive forces in the community?
Yeah, there's actually one of my clients is a company called Liquibase, and they do these things called spotlights, where when a community member does something cool in the community, they just literally just put something up on LinkedIn, Twitter, and wherever, and they just spotlight them, just say something nice about them, and it means the world. But again, we're going to talk about rewards later on in the session at 4 p.m. today. So I know we're out of time. Just so everybody is aware, we will be back at 2 p.m. Eastern time. And Lisa Marie Namphy is going to be facilitating the session on diversity and inclusion in community in 2021. So, looking forward to that session. I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to go on mute. But you're obviously welcome to sit here and chat. Just bear in mind that everything's being recorded right now. So be nice. And then one final thing. So Laura said in the channel, I think our stakeholders who are putting in the investment will be okay with qualitative data rather than quantitative data, but it also needs a bit more evidence than I, community manager, declare success, because that looks kind of self-serving, which I think is a good point. So great stuff. All right. Thank you everyone for the conversation. I'm going to mute and turn my screen off, and then we'll be back at 2 p.m. But again, feel free to keep chatting.